statistic that is run over several years now. I'm just trying to give you a quick sense in a few slides. Questions? Or yeah.
No. Well, okay. I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
don't know who had our hands up first, but I mean, this is the issue with this indicators of subjective indicator. I mean, if you have a national program along these lines, I mean, people might think, wow, we've improved.
Okay.
You know, it's a although if we did a national program like that in Britain, everybody would say, oh, this is going to fail, or this will be. So it's sort of a cultural.
No, you raise a very important issue, Bill, because I think there are two things. Whenever I go and talk to a government, I always tell them that, well, look, the overall study that we do is too high level and may not be customized to your own environment. Right? At the same time, it's very difficult, for example, to compare China with Singapore. You know, we do it, but we know that, just Singapore is one Shanghai, even smaller than Shanghai, and basically, it's a little bit crazy to compare China and Singapore. But having said this, what we do believe is that the overall framework is something which has value. And then you have to apply this to your own country in the form in which it makes sense. In the case of China, for example, we did some work in China in which we took the same framework and we're applying it at the province level. Because even inside in China, the different provinces, and there are huge differences across provinces. So you're applying it at the province level. And maybe some people argue that you do it at the city level, because often a lot of the economic activity happens at the city level. So the actual level of application is a very important question. And what we always advise governments is, please do adapt that framework to your own context, because your own priorities are going to be different. In the case of Qatar, those three ones, political reform, economic development, and social development, are the ones that their government decided. Maybe in the case of the USA is different, France is different, I don't know. So you have to be able to, it's the same issue. You have a strategy and a vision of where you want technology to be applied, but then you have to apply this in a systematic, holistic manner. But that has to be customized to your own organization, to your own country. So we always suggest having a customized, balanced scorecard for your own country. But then you hit the problem in terms of what are you comparing against, right? So I just comparing yourself against yourself. And I think you need to do both. You need to have a benchmark that you keep comparing your progress in a much more detailed, fine-tuned manner for yourself year on year. At the same time, you need to also rank yourself on these global benchmarks, be it this benchmark or some other benchmark, and see how you're comparing with the global players in the space. So I think you need to be able to do both, and I do seriously believe that just the global one is not enough for local application. Local application requires more customization.
Yeah.
So,
but it's critical in this subjective scores, because say if Qatar or Singapore, I can imagine almost everyone in the country in business and government getting on the same page. That this is our plan, we're moving in this direction, we're going to increase science and technology education, and therefore when you get subjective views of business and government, they're likely to, yes, we are improving education.
There is, this is the classical, social science research, problem, right? So there's a data sample. The data sample can bias your results in different ways. So I think that's where you do have to have some guidelines for selecting the data sample. The forum does issue some guidelines. I don't know how well they're enforced by the various parties. But having said this, from experience, what we have seen is that usually it's very difficult because usually private sector leaders are quite critical of the government in most countries. The one or two cases where we have seen problems in the subject data collection has been in mainly African countries, where we don't believe it's an issue of collusion, but it's much more an issue of the partner not doing his job and just filling up forms. So I think that's been a problem. In those cases, we have to discard a few African countries sometimes for out of the data sample. But in general, I think we haven't faced a problem because of lack of integrity or whatever in the people, private sector respondents. But your challenge does remain.
No, we can talk about that with the questions.
Okay, my question is related with the 3 slides you have shown. Under the e-readiness, you have one of the variables was the vision of the government, the ICT vision of the government. Then, this slide focuses on the strategic deployment of technology. My question was, have you seen any correlation between the type of governance and the e-readiness index? I'm saying this because for instance, in Qatar and China, everybody would be it would be easy for the government to have the same sort of vision and deploy it for a reasonable period of time. While in India, if the government changes, the vision gets affected, the policy is pulled out. So basically then measuring the impact of the vision which existed at say time point n changes from n+1 at n+1. So basically that's my question. In the process of measuring the readiness, have you seen any relation between the type of governance and the readiness?
Yeah, the challenge is of course to create a classification of type of governance, so it's I'm not sure there's a classification that I know that easily exists in that space of type of governance. You can measure in terms of quality of we have an indicator of the quality of the government vision with respect to ICT. And I think that's something you can, but in terms of the quality aspects, I don't think we have been able to successfully measure that adequately. But I think your point is a very valid one. And clearly what we do see is that countries that have made good progress are the countries that have clear plans, like Singapore has clear plans, and they're now on the 4th plan, and and the government sticks with it. And India's case is a little bit of a special case because I think India's case is something where a lot of the development has happened without necessarily government planning, in the IT sector. So it's been a much more bottom-up entrepreneurial kind of development. So it's not really driven by massive government planning. Any other questions? Yes.
Can I just on a slightly different but related track? I mean, I forget where I read this. I think it was The Economist, but there is also a democracy index, and on that index, if I remember correctly, the Middle East stands out as being dropping in the rankings, as opposed to everyone else kind of being equal or rising, which would make a very striking.
But more stable, more
stable
for Europe.
Political reform, and you say that business leaders are critical of government, but I mean, political reform, I can imagine getting rid of corruption, yes, is one thing, but democracy is a slightly different thing. I forget whether that index is correct, though. So.
I think it's a good segue probably to the last point, because it comes back to the issues raised earlier, and maybe I'll skip the other slides that I wanted to show because in the interest of time, and just jump to this last thing in terms of evolving it further, because that comes back to some of the issues you raised earlier too. I think today, if you look at the notion of progress, there is a rethinking happening of this, and I'm sure you've heard of the Stiglitz Commission, in France, set up by President Sarkozy. And people are critical of Sarkozy in France. They say, well, he had to do this because he can't show economic growth, so he has to show some other kind of benefits. So for political purposes, this is good. It serves his own political goals. But having said this, there is general sense today that just GDP and economic measures are perhaps not complete. So I think that there's a consensus, and you see this not just from the Stiglitz, the World Economic Forum, but also OECD and the European Commission, and I could have had a few more out there. And this is all relatively recent, so I'm not saying this is something that, and the reason this is important is because if you just look at it as a 10-year cycle, and I started by saying 10 years ago, we were in that stage of technology, okay, so excitement, and people didn't know exactly where to begin, what to do, and so on. And today people are saying, we have made quite a lot of progress in many countries, and we know a little bit what to do, But then the big debate right now is, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? That's, I think, in a sense, a bigger part of the debate right now. And we are also looking at these issues because we see the framework as some kind of a leading framework that leads the development of technology in society and government. And so some of the issues that we see out here is, of course, in general, as we look at progress in society, we have to perhaps have a few changes out here. So there's a mind shift change required from a paradigm that I think has been for a long time production-oriented, economic production-oriented, to a much more of a well-being orientation. And exactly what is well-being is a very subjective thing once again to define, because it's often rooted in local customs, local norms, local habits, and so on. And people also realizing that, and this is especially in light of newer concerns today, that it's not just progress for the sake of progress, but we have to have equity, we have to have sustainability, we have to have something that doesn't destroy the earth. And these kinds of elements are becoming, let's say, much more important. People also realizing, and what the Stiglitz Commission came up with, also saying that, well, look, it may be difficult to come up with this one indicator of well-being, or one indicator of progress, as perhaps we had in GDP. GDP was, one indicator we often use for a long time. So people are saying, well, look, there's a whole bunch of different things emerging, and this is really my last slide, is if we look going forward now, so if we put ourselves today and now in 2010, we've had 10 years of pretty good progress, good use of technology, a lot of buy into this area, and especially I think for OII also, the internet has something that no one, it's a pretty mainstream part of daily life right now. And the question really is, looking forward, what is this technology going to be used for? And the first question that arises out here is that even what are the boundaries of technology? I think there's something I asked you, Bill, what is the boundaries of OII? So when I first came here, is that when we look at the internet, what are we talking about? And it's becoming more and bigger and bigger. And the whole question really is, how do we actually evolve this framework so that we can still provide a meaningful framework? Because today, in some sense, I feel that we are at a similar kind of a challenging position like what we were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, a lot of excitement on the internet. We didn't know exactly how to navigate the space. Today we know a little bit how to navigate the space, we know how to do some things, but then there's all these questions being raised about why we're doing it in the first place. So what is the purpose of doing it? Just to create content and web pages and publish and get people to read it, or is it something to actually create a more meaningful life society? And that space is not clear how to navigate. Today, if you ask people, how should I actually structure my IT program such that I'm able to create technology for a country that makes us use technology, for all these things that we want to do, equitable, sustainable, meaningful, well-being, and so on. How to do it, I don't think the frame that we have today provides the answers. I'm not sure anyone else has the answers today. How do we evolve this? Because at the end of the day, today, right now, 10 years later, there are so many ministries of technology. It exists in almost every country now. And these all ministers looking for guidance, because a lot of the ministers, all they've done for the last few years is look at telecoms deregulation. That's what they've done, more or less, spectrum deregulation, spectrum sales, and telecom operators. And if you actually tell them, well, look, there is a bigger role the telecoms and all this IT infrastructure should play in the country, what is that conceptual anchoring that we can give them? I think this is the big research question that we are facing right now. So if you ask me what is interesting for me today is to come up with the next adaptation of the model. I don't think it has to be a different model, but adaptation of the model that can be as simple, as clear, and hopefully as insightful for people to do something meaningful in this area. But that's the struggle that we are facing right now. Lots of other issues around data collection and so on, but I think the biggest issue is how do we link the internet to some of the bigger issues around progress in society. So let me stop on that, and and then take any questions, or if there are any open discussions and so on.
Excellent. I mean, the immediate follow-up is that the history of this index and so forth is very fascinating, and because it actually in some respects reflects the different value changes and understanding paradigms driving global policy in a variety of ways. So the shift now to more green technology and so forth is going to be reflected in index. It's sort of the politics of indices. The index is being driven in part by shifts in global shifts in the values that people pursue. But this relates to our own problem of, we want to, in studying freedom of expression, for example, we said, well, we've got to have much more systematic measures globally, but obviously I think we'd have two problems. One, politically, it's not necessarily acceptable to say this should be a value that everybody pursues. Mm-hmm. And B, the measurement issues would be just as hard, if not much more difficult than the technology side. I think it's really fascinating. Both the political side of this and also the measurement issues are huge. And I applaud you for, you have to try and something. I agree with you. Something is better than nothing, because people can always adjust their own views of your data based upon their assumptions. But at least you can start a debate, and you can put something on the table that this is what this method yielded.
No, I do believe, and this I generally see this from my own interaction with people, is people, senior leaders, ministers and other senior government leaders, they do want some framework to think. Yeah. It's very difficult to just look at this huge space. It's too big and it's too amorphous and it's too overwhelming. And you need to be able to provide some anchors to think for people. And so I think we do have a responsibility out here to try to come up with a structuring of the space that can be used for people for action.
Questions? Yes, Mary?
Related to what Bill said, I was also thinking about this whole issue of, during your talk, which was, by the way, very interesting, and also reminding again of how important it is to have parameters and also just comparable figures. But I was, during the talk, again thinking, what was it again for? Like, why, what was the actual general motivation to map this, because in the beginning it was about measuring also level of competitiveness of countries and being able to, so again, I would like to again ask, what is the exact actual motive of, apart from having lists of figures, but and also related to that, another question just pops up immediately is about the whole issue of objectiveness and subjectiveness of doing such research and designing these parameters. Of course, you said somewhere like it's dependent, independent, etc. But we know there's a whole body of literature about the whole issue of, bodies like the World Economic Forum, World Bank, etc. itself sort of representing a kind of ideological, or at least an economic framework that with free market incentives and neoliberal motivated frameworks. How do you combine, how can you be critical and independent and knowing that somewhere very far deep there is this pushing factor?
No, so I think you raised some very interesting and important points. As I explained at the start of my talk, the origins of this very much was back in the 90s, late 90s, a lot of excitement around technology, a lot of anecdotes, not enough data. So the focus really was on trying to provide some data for decisions, and at the same time provide some guidelines and a conceptual framework for people to take action. That was the basic, goals initially. I don't think there was any, preordained grand theory behind pushing any one particular view. I think what we just tried to say was, based on our expert collective judgment, what did we think were the right players to bring into the loop? In this case, we identified individuals, civil society, business and governments, and we tried to identify what were the enablers, so the enabling conditions that would enable them to actually act and produce the right results. I think the independence thing is something that we, I think that's one reason why the forum collaborates with academic institutions. So bringing in academics, they can be a little bit more free from these kinds of, let's say, accusations in that sense. Because as being an academic institution, you can always say, well, look, we're not necessarily, pushing any one. Well, you might be pushing, but in any case, you might not be pushing anyone's ideological point of view necessarily. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
It's just in a slightly different direction. So, presumably Korea is very high up on the network already. So what are countries like that and countries like, I think I saw Denmark also being near the top. What are those countries really, what's their next step, or what would you tell them to do? I mean, I'm sure there are lots of other issues at the other extreme and so on, but what are those very advanced countries trying to do that they're not doing yet?
Well, I think, if you look at these very advanced countries, what they're trying to do at this point is struggle with some of these questions that I said at the very end. What is they all are concerned about having, industries and creating jobs and those are like the hygiene factors, I would say, more or less in this space. So, you do need to keep that going. But I think there is a concern today about how can technology be used for these bigger goals that the government is setting for itself and its society. In the case of Korea, just to add a comment out there, I think Korea doesn't necessarily, even though it is a rich country today, I think the Koreans don't see themselves as a rich country necessarily. They still feel they have to fight and they have to prove themselves in the world, and so they still have this they also sandwich between China and Japan, and so they have this thing that they have to keep on fighting. So I think in Korea you still do see this urge for technological domination, by which I mean being at the leading edge, be there the bleeding edge of technology. So I think Korea is still very much not yet at this kind of debate. Korea is very much in let's actually maintain technology leadership, let's create jobs, let's export the best technologies and the best products and actually maintain technology leadership. So they see the technology leadership as being a very it's a continuous race. You have to keep running out there. There's no stopping out there. I don't think countries like Denmark see technology leadership as their driving force for their future. There it's more, let's actually use it in a better, more effective fashion. But I think most countries today are not yet thinking in this dimension. They're mostly concerned with leadership, job creation, entrepreneurship, and those kinds of elements, production-oriented elements. This thinking that I talked about from production to well-being is something which is really happening as we speak. So governments and so on are, they are the several years behind. Maybe if we had the same discussion in 5 years' time, you might have a different situation then.
I was also thinking about broadband and mobile data. I mean, are those countries thinking that must be distributed much more?
Yeah, but those are becoming almost like hygiene factors. When I'm saying hygiene factors, I'm being a little bit too simplistic, let's say, because everyone knows broadband as mobile is there for everyone. As today, it's 100% penetration in most or more in most countries in the world. Broadband, everyone knows that this has to come. It's a question whether your 3G networks are good enough to have them on mobile or not. So I think today the questioning of there are also studies done that have shown what I call the 1 to 10 ratio, that shows that for every 10 percentage points that you might increase your telecoms infrastructure, you typically get 1 percentage point increase in growth. roughly the number of studies that show similar kind of statistics in the World Bank, other people. So the relationship between telecoms investment and growth has been proven in some sense, or at least demonstrated quite in multiple studies, including some of our own studies. So what you find is that those are becoming like almost, challenges that are occupying governments today. So today, governments are actually concerned with exactly the same issues. Mobile, broadband, those are right on top of the agenda. This is not on the horizon. This is further up in the horizon for governments. But what we're trying to do from a research perspective is trying to, shift the focus of governments 5 years ahead and say, okay, look, you're focusing on that right now, but there's something else coming up front. Yeah.
Well, sort of supplementary to Ralph's, and then just second part, if I could just push us back to some of the questions earlier. I mean, Ralph seized on a particular country, and one of the few surprises I had in terms of ranking was Israel. They seem to be quite low, which really surprised me, because they had first-rate universities, enormous entrepreneurship, density of small countries. I wonder if you had any comments on that. I know Israel's always a tricky case, but I thought of them as, I would expect to see them right up in the top decile. And can I structure that as a supplementary to pushing back to the earlier question? I mean, this issue of who's this for, and I assume, as you've confirmed, it's in some sense mostly for governments, what they can do not to hinder or to help. And the thing that has always struck me, strong feeling I've had for a long time, is that in democracies of the kind of the class this country fits in, France, others, I mean, government seems to me can take virtually no credit for any of the positive features. We have some of the best. We have the best universities in Europe. In Britain, government can't take any credit for that. Internet penetration, phone penetration, it's Vodafone. It's nothing to do with the government. And France, I mean, we all know in France, the state through Minitel was able actually to hold back the internet by 10 years. So I mean, it seems to me that in the countries of this type, government activity seems to be almost entirely negative. I don't have any views on that.
Okay, let's take the Israel one first. First of all, Israel's score is pretty good. So,
Is it?
So,
I misread it.
Yeah, no, pretty good. It's not in the top 10, but it's
Oh,
like
is it?
20, 23, 24, something
That's what I saw,
like
yeah, I
yeah,
was
so
surprised
something
at that,
like
yeah.
that. So, which is actually pretty good because you know how the rankings go. The actual difference in actual scores is quite small.
Okay.
But having said this, Israel has a couple of issues. You mentioned the universities. Yes, Israeli students are great and faculty are great, but the universities are actually not very good on a global scale. If you look at most rankings of universities, that are produced, Israeli universities is the highest one. Tel Aviv, I think, comes up probably 60 or 70, something like that. It's not even the top 50. When I go to Israel and I tell them about that, and they all, agreed with that. But there's issues around why universities actually haven't delivered to the capability levels that they could. If you look at, for example, even in Israel, there is Israel's rise in technology has been fairly recent. It's not a very old phenomenon. That's been driven largely by the huge Soviet emigration into the country. Because what happened basically, all the Soviets came in. They were trained engineers and physicists, and they didn't have jobs. And they needed to find jobs, and basically they created jobs, but there were no jobs. So that has led to a very good thing, and the Israeli military helps and project training and so on and so forth. But there's a number of factors out there. But one thing which is also the problem in Israel is that the culture is such in which people don't build. Okay, they sell too early. Okay, so the Israeli model is they create ideas and sell to American companies. Okay. So the very few software companies in Israel that have actually become big global companies. The biggest one, I think, is Amdocs, that exists. But the Israeli culture very much is of entrepreneurs starting something and exiting very quickly. And so basically what happens is a lot of the products that come out of Israel eventually get absorbed and bought by American companies and are not necessarily being used inside the country to create other kinds of things. And of course, as you know, in such society, they have fairly strong divisions and problems between different segments of the society. In terms of more developed economies and the role of the government, I still think the government plays a very important role, including in the U.S. Look at the U.S. The internet, of course, is the U.S. government creation. No, but even today, if you look at, for example, I think the numbers could be right, slightly off, but around 30%, correct me if I'm wrong, 30% of all U.S. government procurement goes to small businesses. Okay, and how do they define a small business? They define a small business as 500 employees or less. 500 employees is a very big number, because 500 employees usually you can actually go public after that. So the US government plays a very key role in supporting small companies through the Small Business Act, way up to the market when they reach the stock markets. I think government procurement is a very key role in almost all countries. You mentioned Minitel, and I live in France. I think, Flora, are you French or?
Yeah, I'm French, yes.
You're French, okay. You're hesitating a little bit, okay.
It's okay.
So in France, for example, France Telecom was late, but then they invested. And today, if you look at the entire, France is probably one of the best digital exchanges in the whole world. And today, France is one of the most competitive telecom rates in the most developed world. So I think the French telecom infrastructure, the cost of internet access, it's very, very good today in terms of price point. So I think the government does play a very important role, and I think we should not underestimate the role of the government. Could it be better? Of course, anything can be better. But
I would only add also liberalization of telecoms was a big driving force for lower prices of
and the
telephone
government
and internet services.
I mean, the role of the government has only become more powerful in the last 18 months. The last 2 years, 24 months, has only seen the role of the government become even more important and across the world, especially in the developed world. So I would not discount the role of the government. I think it's something which is very important.
Roland, you had?
Yeah, coming back to the Sarkozy-Sean and Stiglitz report and this required move from production to consumption, how do you see the development and introduction of a new index based on ICT? Do you think it's feasible or relevant?
Sorry, the new index ICT?
No, I mean, since we are looking for a new measure for economic performance and well-being, what is, in your opinion, the place of an index based on the ICT penetration?
Whatever index the world comes up with for this well-being or this balanced scorecard of indicators or tableau de bord or whatever they come up with, we'll have to use ICT. There's no question about that. And it's so because technology becomes so pervasive. It's part of health, education, finance. Talk about anything. Technology is part of that. So we might have the same problem that I was mentioning earlier today to Yorick about in business schools. In some sense, as technology become more successful, the demand for MBA students for classes in technology decreased. Paradoxically, why? Because there is more and more technology being taught by marketing, by finance, by different disciplines themselves, because they've absorbed that. So it's an interesting question of whether or not in the future, it's one of the things I'm also open to, whether you need an ICT framework or whether the framework becomes a general framework and ICT actually enters into the picture everywhere. So there is a whole debate out there. I don't have the answer, and I think you're seeing also emerging things around innovation nowadays. We do some work in innovation, and classically, most countries haven't had innovation ministries, right?
About innovation, I would be curious to know what data do you use to measure in the usage thing the innovation of a country? I mean, it's the number of
that's a different talk. We have a global innovation index, so it's a different talk. That's a different talk. But I think the notion is, as technology becomes more pervasive, how do you actually, because the goal is not to have a technology index for the sake of having a technology index. The goal is to be able to help governments do the right things, to use technology the right way. And what is the best way to make it happen? That's the key question. I think that's where, the same thing with internet, it's not just have broadband and have internet penetration. The question is, how to make sure internet is used in the right way for the good goals that you set for yourself. So.
One of the things, this is a very different level, but one thing that we can help with, you've probably already done this, but there are a lot of people around the table who could help you with thinking about ways of validating some of your indices, like maybe taking subsamples where we have more other types of indicators for each country and stuff. Yeah. So we could help you think about actually determining what validity or bias a particular measure has.
No, that would be very good. In fact, I forgot to mention, all the data that we have is available for public use. It's there online, and it's open for public use. So if you all want to use it, if you want to massage it, or you want to come back and give some feedback about how to improve it, yeah, definitely. We're very happy to get your feedback.